The afternoon Katherine Trent watched her husband die in a riding accident was the last time her brother-in-law looked at her with anything resembling kindness. She had screamed for Henry to check the saddle one more time before mounting the wild stallion they had purchased just 3 days prior, but he had laughed and kissed her forehead, telling her not to worry so much. When the girth strap broke and Henry fell beneath those thrashing hooves, something inside Katherine shattered that would take years to mend. It was April 1876, and Red Bluff, California was still rough country where accidents happened, and life moved on whether you were ready or not. Samuel Trent stood at his brother's graveside with his jaw clenched so tight Katherine could see the muscle jumping beneath his weathered skin. He was 32, 5 years older than Henry had been, and he had never married. The ranch they had built together now fell entirely on his shoulders, along with Henry's widow. She was 24, far too young to be wearing black and standing in a cemetery with her whole life turned to ash. "You should have stopped him," Samuel said 3 days after the funeral. They were sitting in the kitchen of the ranch house, and Katherine was trying to eat soup that tasted like sawdust. "You knew that horse was not properly broken." Katherine set down her spoon carefully. "I told him to check the saddle. You should have insisted." Samuel's voice was flat, emotionless, which somehow made it worse than if he had shouted. "Henry always listened to you. If you had really tried, he would have waited." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Katherine wanted to defend herself, to explain that Henry had been stubborn and excited and so full of life that morning that nothing could have slowed him down. But grief had stolen her voice, and Samuel's grief had turned to anger that needed a target. She was convenient. The months that followed were a slow descent into hell wrapped in California sunshine. The ranch struggled because Samuel threw himself into work with a ferocity that burned out the hired hands and left the animals skittish. When 3 steers broke through a fence and scattered into the hills, Samuel blamed Katherine for distracting him during repairs. When a barn cat killed a chicken, it was because Katherine had not closed the coop properly, even though Samuel had been the last one out that evening. When his favorite saddle developed a crack in the leather, somehow that was her fault too. "You are trying to ruin everything Henry built," Samuel told her one evening in late September. They had just lost a contract with a cattle buyer because Samuel had been too abrasive during negotiations. "Ever since he died, nothing has gone right." Katherine stood at the kitchen counter, her hands shaking as she kneaded bread dough. "I am trying to help. I do everything I can. Your everything is not enough." Samuel grabbed his hat and headed for the door. "I am going to town. Try not to burn the house down while I am gone." She cried into the bread dough that night, her tears mixing with the flour until she had to start over. The loneliness was crushing. She had no family left, her parents having died years before. Henry's friends had been kind at first, but Samuel's hostility had created an invisible wall around the ranch. No one wanted to get caught in the middle of family drama, so they stayed away. By November, Katherine was considering leaving. She had a little money Henry had left her, enough to buy a train ticket to San Francisco where she might find work. But the thought of abandoning the ranch, the last piece of Henry that remained, felt like a betrayal. So she stayed and endured Samuel's blame, his cold silences, his accusations that seemed to multiply with each passing day. The winter of 1877 arrived with freezing rain that turned the ranch into a sea of mud. One of the horses developed colic, and Samuel spent 2 days nursing it back to health while Katherine ran the rest of the operation. When the horse recovered, Samuel did not thank her. When it died anyway a week later, he stood in the barn and said, "You probably fed it something wrong when I was not looking." Katherine had stopped crying by then. She had stopped defending herself too. She simply existed, moving through her days like a ghost, waiting for something to change. Change arrived in March on a paint horse, wearing a dusty brown coat and a hat that had seen better days. Garrett Quinn was a cowboy who had heard the Trent ranch was looking for hands. He was 26, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of summer grass. When he knocked on the door, Katherine answered and forgot how to speak for a moment. "Help you, madam?" he asked, polite and patient. "I think you want my brother-in-law," she managed. "He handles the hiring." Samuel came to the door and looked Garrett up and down with his usual suspicious glare. "You have experience." "15 years, sir. Started when I was 11 on my father's spread in Texas. Can handle cattle, horses, repairs, pretty much anything you need." "We had 3 men quit in the last 2 months," Samuel said bluntly. "Work is hard and I do not tolerate laziness." Garrett met his eyes steadily. "I do not quit and I am not lazy." Something in his tone must have satisfied Samuel because he nodded curtly. "You can start tomorrow. Pay is $30 a month plus meals and a bunk in the barn." "Fair enough." As Garrett turned to leave, his eyes met Katherine's for just a moment. There was no pity there, no judgment, just a quiet acknowledgement that made her feel seen for the first time in months. Garrett proved himself within the first week. He was up before dawn and worked until the stars came out, never complaining, never cutting corners. He had a way with the horses that bordered on magical, gentling even the most skittish animals with patience and a soft voice. The other 2 remaining ranch hands, Old Tom and young Billy, took to him immediately. Katherine noticed because she could not help but notice. Garrett moved through the world with a quiet confidence that was nothing like Henry's boisterous charm or Samuel's bitter intensity. He was just himself, solid and steady as the earth. The first time Samuel tried to blame Katherine in front of Garrett, it was over a broken water trough. A support beam had rotted through, and the whole thing had collapsed, flooding part of the paddock. "This is what happens when you do not check things properly," Samuel snapped at Katherine. She had been carrying feed to the chickens when he found her. "How many times do I have to tell you to inspect the equipment?" "I inspected it last month," Katherine said quietly. "The wood was fine then." Obviously, it was not fine. Garrett appeared from the barn, hammer in hand. He had been working on a stall door. "Excuse me, Mr. Trent, but I checked that trough 2 days ago. The rot was on the inside where you could not see it without taking the whole thing apart." No amount of inspection would have caught it. Samuel's face darkened. "I was not talking to you, Quinn." "I know, sir. Just thought you should know it was not anyone's fault, just wood rot. Happens." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Samuel looked like he wanted to argue but could not find the angle. Finally, he turned and stalked off toward the house. Katherine stood frozen, the feed bucket heavy in her arms. Garrett went back to his hammer, but before he disappeared into the barn, he glanced at her and said quietly, "Nothing wrong is on you, madam. That was just bad luck." Those simple words cracked something open inside her chest. She blinked rapidly and hurried to the chicken coop before the tears could fall. After that, Garrett seemed to develop an uncanny ability to appear whenever Samuel started in on Katherine. When a fence rail broke during a cattle drive and Samuel began shouting about incompetence, Garrett pointed out the rail had been struck by lightning the night before. When a pot of stew burned because Katherine had been called away to help with a difficult foaling, and Samuel complained about wasted food, Garrett mentioned that he had been the one to ask for her help, and the timing had been unavoidable. "You are not her keeper, Quinn," Samuel said one evening in May. They were all in the kitchen, which was unusual because the hired hands typically ate in the bunkhouse. But rain was pouring down and Katherine had insisted they come inside. "No, sir," Garrett agreed. Just telling the truth as I see it. The truth is that this ranch has been falling apart since my brother died, and she has not helped matters." Katherine stood at the stove with her back to them, stirring beans that did not need stirring. Her shoulders were rigid with the effort of not crying. "Respectfully, sir, from what I have seen, Mrs. Trent works harder than anyone else on this property," Garrett said. His voice was calm but firm. "She is up earlier than all of us, and she is still working after we have gone to bed. If this ranch is struggling, it is not because of her." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of rain on the roof. Katherine could feel Samuel's anger like heat from a fire. She turned slowly, expecting to see Garrett packing his things after being fired on the spot. But Samuel just stood there, his face unreadable. Finally, he said, "Mind your own business, Quinn," and walked out into the rain. Tom and Billy exchanged glances and quickly excused themselves. Garrett remained, sitting at the table with his coffee. Katherine's hands trembled as she served the beans. "You should not have said that." "He is going to fire you." "Maybe." Garrett took a bite, chewed thoughtfully, but it needed saying. "Why?" the question burst out of her. "Why do you care? You barely know me." Garrett set down his fork and looked at her directly. Those green eyes were serious. "Because I have been watching for 2 months, Mrs. Trent. I have seen how hard you work and how he treats you. A man should not talk to a woman that way, especially when she is grieving and trying her best. It is not right. He blames me for Henry's death. That is grief talking, not sense. His brother made a choice to ride that horse. That is not on you." Katherine sat down heavily in the chair across from him. "Everyone else just looks away. I am not everyone else." They sat in silence for a while, the rain drumming its rhythm overhead. Katherine felt something shifting inside her, like ice breaking up on a frozen river. For the first time in a year, she did not feel completely alone. Garrett was not fired. In fact, Samuel seemed to back off slightly after that confrontation, though his coldness toward Katherine did not entirely thaw. But he stopped blaming her quite so openly, at least when Garrett was within earshot. As spring turned to summer, Katherine found herself drawn to the cowboy with the quiet strength and the kind eyes. It started innocently, conversations while she brought water to the men working in the fields, or moments when they found themselves in the barn at the same time. Garrett told her about growing up in Texas, about his parents who had died of fever when he was 19, about the years he had spent drifting from ranch to ranch, never quite finding a place that felt like home. "Why did you come to California?" Katherine asked one evening. She had brought out a basket of food for the men, and Garrett was helping her carry it. "Wanted to see the ocean," he said simply. "Heard about it all my life. Figured I should see it before I get too old." "Have you seen it yet?" "Not yet. Stopped here and found work." "Figure the ocean will still be there when I am ready." Katherine smiled, a real smile that felt strange on her face after so long. "It is only about 150 miles west. You ever seen it?" "Once. Henry and I went to San Francisco for our honeymoon." "The ocean was bigger than I expected. Louder, too." "You miss him?" Garrett asked gently. "Every day, but it is different now. The sharp pain has faded to an ache." She looked at Garrett. "Is that terrible?" "No, madam, that is healing." Their friendship deepened through the summer months. Garrett had a way of making her laugh, something she thought she had forgotten how to do. He told ridiculous stories about ranch mishaps and stubborn cattle, and he listened when she needed to talk about Henry, about the good memories that Samuel's anger had almost made her forget. Samuel noticed. Of course he noticed. "You are spending a lot of time with Quinn," he said one August morning. Katherine was making breakfast and Samuel had come in earlier than usual. "He is a good man and a good friend," Katherine replied carefully. "He is a drifter. Probably move on before winter. Maybe." "That is his choice." Samuel poured himself coffee, his movements jerky with irritation. People are going to talk if they see you getting too friendly with a hired hand. Let them talk. I have done nothing wrong. Nothing wrong. Samuel slammed his cup down. Your husband has been dead barely a year, and you are out there fluttering around a cowboy half the day. Heat flooded Katherine's face. I am not fluttering around anyone. I am trying to keep this ranch running just like you. Garrett is my friend. That is all. That better be all. Samuel grabbed his hat. Because if you shame Henry's memory, I will never forgive you. He left before Katherine could respond. She stood there shaking with anger and something else, something that felt like awakening. Because if she was honest with herself, Garrett Quinn was becoming more than a friend. She looked forward to seeing him every morning. She found excuses to be near him. When their hands accidentally touched passing a tool or a bucket, her heart stuttered in her chest. And that terrified her because she was not ready. Was she? Garrett seemed to sense her confusion because he started keeping a bit more distance. It hurt, but Katherine understood. He was being respectful, giving her space to sort through her complicated feelings. Then in September, everything changed. A group of cattle rustlers had been working the area, and several ranches had lost stock. Samuel posted watches at night, and the men took turns patrolling the property. On a Thursday night when the moon was just a sliver in the sky, gunshots rang out from the north pasture. Katherine was in the house when she heard them. She grabbed Henry's rifle from above the mantel and ran outside, her heart pounding. More shots. Men shouting. She ran toward the sound, her nightgown catching on brush and thorns. She found Samuel and Tom pinned down behind a water trough, bullets kicking up dirt around them. 3 men on horseback were firing from the tree line, trying to drive off about 20 head of cattle. Katherine did not think. She raised the rifle and fired toward the rustlers, not aiming to hit anyone but to make them think twice. One of the riders wheeled his horse around, and that is when Garrett appeared from the other side, driving his horse straight at the rustlers with his rope spinning. He lassoed one man right off his saddle, and Billy came charging in from the barn with a shotgun. The rustlers decided they were outnumbered and fled, leaving their companion tied up and cursing in the dirt. The sheriff came at dawn to collect the prisoner. Samuel was almost cheerful, the closest to happy Katherine had seen him since Henry died. They had saved the cattle and caught one of the thieves. It was a victory, but Katherine could not stop shaking. She stood on the porch watching the sheriff's wagon disappear down the road, and her hands trembled so hard she had to clasp them together. Mrs. Trent. She turned to find Garrett standing behind her, his hat in his hands. There was a cut on his cheek and dirt all over his clothes, but he was looking at her with such concern that her eyes filled with tears. "You could have been killed," she whispered. "So could you. You should not have come out there. Neither should you have charged them like that." "What were you thinking?" "I was thinking I was not going to let anyone hurt what matters." His voice was rough, intense in a way she had never heard before. They stared at each other, and something unspoken passed between them. Katherine knew in that moment that she was in love with Garrett Quinn, had probably been falling for months without letting herself acknowledge it. And from the way he was looking at her, he felt the same. "Garrett," she breathed. He stepped closer, and she thought he might kiss her. She wanted him to. But then Samuel's voice called from the barn, and they both stepped back, the moment broken. "Later," Garrett said softly. "We will talk later." But later turned into days of awkward avoidance because neither of them knew how to start the conversation. Katherine agonized over it. Was it too soon? Would people judge her? Did she even have the right to be happy again? Samuel's suspicion grew with each passing day. He watched Katherine and Garrett like a hawk, and his old anger started returning. "You are going to humiliate yourself," he told Katherine one evening in early October. "Chasing after a man young enough to be your little brother. He is 2 years younger than me, Samuel, hardly scandalous. He is a nobody, a drifter with no prospects and no land. Henry left you part of this ranch. You have a position now, responsibilities. You cannot just throw that away on some cowboy who will be gone by Christmas. Why are you so convinced he will leave? Because men like that always do. They do not stick around. And when he breaks your heart, do not come crying to me." Katherine looked at her brother-in-law, really looked at him, and saw something she had missed before: fear. Samuel was terrified of losing the last connection to his brother. If Katherine fell in love with someone else, moved on with her life, he would be alone with his grief and his guilt. "Samuel," she said gently, "Henry would want us to be happy, both of us. Do not tell me what my brother would want." His voice cracked. "You do not get to speak for him. Neither do you." He left without another word, and Katherine knew the situation could not continue. Something had to give. The breaking point came on a crisp October morning when one of the barn cats had kittens in a pile of hay. Katherine found them and was delighted, kneeling down to watch the tiny creatures nurse. Garrett came in to start his morning work and knelt beside her. "New lives," he said softly. "Always a good sign." "I used to want children," Katherine said suddenly. "Henry and I tried for 3 years. It never happened. I am sorry. Maybe it was for the best. I could not imagine raising a child alone." Garrett looked at her intently. "You would not have to be alone," her breath caught. "Garrett, I know it is too soon, and I know you are still grieving, and I know I have no right," he said in a rush. "But I have to tell you before I lose my nerve. I am in love with you, Katherine. I have been for months, and I am not going anywhere unless you tell me to leave." Joy and fear warred in her chest. "Samuel will be furious." "I do not care about Samuel. I care about you. What do you want?" What did she want? Katherine looked at this good man who had defended her, supported her, made her laugh, and made her feel alive again. She thought about Henry and knew with absolute certainty that he would not want her to spend the rest of her life in mourning and misery. He had loved life too much for that. "I want you," she whispered. "I love you too." Garrett's face transformed with a smile that took her breath away. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull back, and cupped her face in his calloused hands. When he kissed her, it was gentle and sweet and full of promise. Katherine felt like she was coming home after a long, cold journey. They broke apart when they heard footsteps, but not quickly enough. Samuel stood in the barn doorway, his face a mask of fury. "You disgrace him," he said, his voice shaking. "In his own barn, you disgrace his memory." "No," Katherine said firmly. She stood up, and Garrett stood beside her. "I am honoring his memory by choosing to live instead of just existing. Henry would understand that, even if you cannot." "Get off my property," Samuel said to Garrett. "It is not just your property," Katherine replied. "Henry left me a share, remember? Garrett has done nothing wrong, neither have I. You have been a widow barely 18 months. And I have been grieving for every single day of that time. But I have also been living, working, trying to move forward. You are the one who is stuck, Samuel. You are the one who cannot let go." Samuel's face crumpled, and for a moment he looked lost. "He was my brother, and he was my husband. I miss him every day. But he is gone, and we are still here, and we have to keep living. You can either accept that, or you can stay angry forever. But I am done letting you blame me for things that are not my fault." The words hung in the air. Katherine could see the war playing out on Samuel's face, anger and grief and something that might have been shame. Finally, he turned and walked away without another word. "What do we do now?" Garrett asked quietly. "We move forward," Katherine said. "Together." The next weeks were tense. Samuel barely spoke to either of them, but he did not fire Garrett and he did not force Katherine to leave. It was a cold truce, but it was something. In late November, a letter arrived from a rancher in Oregon offering to buy half of the Trent cattle at a very good price. Samuel came to Katherine with the letter, his expression uncertain. "This could get us out of debt," he said. "But it would require driving the cattle north before the winter storms hit. I cannot do it alone with just 3 men." "Then hire more men," Katherine said. She was darning socks and did not look up. "I do not have the money to hire more men until after we sell the cattle." Katherine set down her darning. "What are you really asking me, Samuel?" He shifted uncomfortably. "I need Quinn. He is the best horseman we have. But if he goes, we will need you to manage things here with Tom." "You trust me to manage the ranch?" Samuel looked at her directly for the first time in weeks. "You have been managing half of it for months. I am not blind. I know you work hard." It was not an apology, but it was close. Katherine nodded slowly. "Then Garrett should go with you. It is a good opportunity." The cattle drive was planned for the first week of December. Garrett was clearly torn between the excitement of the adventure and leaving Katherine behind. "It is only 3 weeks, maybe 4, Katherine assured him. They were standing by the corral, watching the sunset paint the sky orange and pink. "A lot can happen in 4 weeks. "Nothing is going to happen. I will be here when you get back." He turned to her, serious. "When I get back, I am going to ask you properly. To marry me, I mean. If you think you might say yes, tell me now so I have something to hold on to during the cold nights." Katherine smiled, her heart full. "I think I might say yes." He kissed her then, not caring who saw, and Katherine kissed him back with all the love and hope she had been holding inside. The cattle drive left on a Monday morning with Samuel, Garrett, Billy, and 2 other hired hands. Katherine and old Tom waved them off, and then Katherine threw herself into work. There was plenty to do to keep the ranch running, and staying busy helped the time pass. Samuel returned 4 weeks later looking exhausted but triumphant. The sale had gone through and he had money to pay debts and invest in the spring herd. But he was alone except for Billy. Katherine's heart stopped. "Where is Garrett?" Samuel's expression was unreadable. "We need to talk." Terror gripped her. "Is he hurt? Is he dead?" "Samuel, tell me." "He is not dead. Calm down." "Then where is he?" Samuel dismounted slowly, like every bone in his body hurt. "There was a bad storm in Northern California. We got separated from the herd. Quinn went one way, I went another, trying to round them up. When we finally got the cattle back together, he had a badly sprained ankle, could not ride." "Where is he?" Katherine demanded again. "I left him in a town called Redding with a doctor. He was going to stay there until he could ride again, then head back here." Samuel paused. "That was 10 days ago. 10 days. Why did it take you so long to get home?" "There were complications with the sale, legal documents. It took longer than expected." Samuel pulled a letter from his pocket. "He gave me this for you." Katherine tore it open with shaking hands. Garrett's handwriting was messy but readable. "Katherine, do not worry. I am fine. The ankle is not serious, just needs rest. I will be home as soon as I can ride. Wait for me. I love you. Garrett." She clutched the letter to her chest, relief making her dizzy. Samuel cleared his throat. "I saw how he looked when he talked about you, and I saw how terrified you were just now when you thought something had happened to him." Katherine looked at her brother-in-law warily. And I have been a bastard." The word sounded strange coming from Samuel. "I blamed you because it was easier than blaming myself. I told Henry to buy that horse. I am the one who checked the saddle that morning. If anyone is responsible, it is me." Katherine's eyes filled with tears. "It was not your fault, Samuel. It was not anyone's fault. It was just a terrible accident. I know that now, or maybe I always knew it, but I could not face it." He looked old suddenly, worn down by grief and guilt. "Henry would hate what I have become. He would hate how I have treated you." He would forgive you just like I do." Samuel's eyes reddened, but he did not cry. "Quinn is a good man. If he makes you happy, then you have my blessing." It was the apology Katherine had been waiting for. She hugged Samuel and he hugged her back stiffly, but it was a start. Garrett arrived 5 days later, riding carefully on his still tender ankle. Katherine saw him coming up the road and ran to meet him, not caring about propriety or appearances. He dismounted and caught her in his arms, and they held each other like they might never let go. "I thought you were never coming back," she said against his chest. "I told you I was not going anywhere." He pulled back to look at her. "Now I have something important to ask you." "Ask me." He went down on one knee right there in the dusty road, holding her hand. "Katherine Trent, I know I am just a cowboy with nothing but a horse and a saddle to my name. But I love you with everything I am, and I will spend the rest of my life making you happy if you will let me. Will you marry me?" "Yes," Katherine said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, absolutely yes." He stood and kissed her, and it felt like beginning again, like stepping out of darkness into light. They were married in January of 1878 in a small ceremony at the Red Bluff Church. Samuel walked Katherine down the aisle and shook Garrett's hand afterward, which felt like a miracle. Old Tom cried, and Billy played a surprisingly good fiddle at the reception. It was simple and perfect. Samuel offered them a portion of the ranch as a wedding gift, but Garrett and Katherine decided to start their own spread instead. They found a beautiful piece of land 20 miles south with a creek running through it and good grazing. Samuel helped them secure the loan, and by spring they were building their own house. It was hard work but good work. Katherine had never been happier. She and Garrett worked side by side, building their life together board by board, fence post by fence post. They laughed more than they struggled, and they talked about everything under the stars at night. In September, Katherine realized she was pregnant. When she told Garrett, he picked her up and spun her around until she was dizzy and laughing. "We are going to have a baby," he kept saying, like he could not quite believe it. "We are going to be a family." Their son was born in May of 1879, a healthy baby boy with Garrett's green eyes and Katherine's dark hair. They named him Henry, after the man who had first brought Katherine to California and who would always hold a place in her heart. Samuel came to visit often, and he was surprisingly good with the baby. He was softer now. The anger finally burned out of him. He even started courting a widow in town, a kind woman who made him smile. Katherine stood on the porch of her home one evening, watching Garrett play with their son in the yard. The sun was setting, painting everything gold, and she felt such overwhelming gratitude that she could barely breathe. She had survived grief and guilt and loneliness. She had found love again in the most unexpected place, and she had learned that healing was possible, even when you thought you were broken beyond repair. Garrett looked up and caught her watching. He smiled, that beautiful smile that had first made her feel seen, and she smiled back. "What are you thinking about?" he called. "How lucky I am," she called back. "How happy." "Same here," he said, and she knew he meant it. The years passed sweetly. They had 2 more children, a daughter named Margaret in 1881 and another son named Thomas in 1884. The ranch prospered, and so did their love. Garrett was everything Katherine had never known to hope for, a partner who supported her dreams and shared her burdens and made her laugh even on the hardest days. Samuel married his widow, a woman named Ellen, and they had a quiet contentment that suited them both. He and Katherine became close again, bonded by their shared memories of Henry but no longer haunted by them. He was an excellent uncle to Katherine's children, patient and playful in ways he had never been before. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Garrett surprised Katherine with a trip to the ocean. They left the children with Samuel and Ellen and rowed west until they could hear the waves. They stood on the beach, hand in hand, watching the endless water roll toward them. "I finally made it," Garrett said, "with the best traveling companion I could have asked for." "Was it worth the wait?" Katherine asked. He pulled her close, kissing her temple. "Everything with you has been worth it, every single moment." Katherine leaned into his embrace and thought about the scared, grieving woman she had been 10 years ago. That woman would never have believed she could be this happy again. But here she was, loved and whole and free. "Nothing wrong is on you," Garrett had told her once, and she had finally learned to believe it. The past could not be changed, but the future was theirs to build. And they had built something beautiful together, something that would last. As the sun set over the Pacific, painting the waves gold and orange, Katherine sent a silent thank you to Henry, wherever he was. "Thank you for bringing me here. Thank you for the love we shared. And thank you for letting me go so I could love again." Then she turned to Garrett, this good man who had saved her in every way that mattered, and said, "Take me home." "Always," he promised, and they walked back toward their horses, toward their children, toward the life they had created together. The ranch continued to thrive over the years. By 1890, the Quinn spread was known throughout the county for quality cattle and well-trained horses. Garrett had a gift for breeding and training that made their stock highly sought after. Katherine managed the business side with a sharp mind and fair dealings that earned respect from buyers and neighbors alike. Henry, their eldest, grew into a thoughtful young man who loved working the land as much as his father did. At 16, he was already as good a horseman as Garrett, and he had his mother's head for figures. Margaret was 13, spirited and bright, with a gift for healing animals that reminded Katherine of the gentle way Garrett had always worked with creatures. Little Thomas, at 11, was the dreamer of the family, always sketching in his notebooks or telling elaborate stories that made everyone laugh. Samuel and Ellen remained close neighbors in spirit if not in distance. Samuel had finally found peace, and his letters to Katherine were warm and full of stories about his stepchildren and his expanding business ventures. He wrote once that he thought Henry would be proud of them both, and Katherine believed it was true. Life was not without its challenges. There were years when drought threatened the cattle, seasons when prices dropped and money was tight, moments when Katherine still felt the old grief wash over her unexpectedly. But she and Garrett faced everything together, their bond only strengthening with time and shared struggles. One autumn evening in 1892, Katherine and Garrett sat on their porch watching the sun sink below the hills. The children were inside doing their evening chores, their voices floating out through the open windows. Garrett reached over and took Katherine's hand, his thumb tracing the familiar calluses from years of work. "You remember the first time I told you that nothing wrong was on you?" he asked. Katherine smiled. "I remember. It was about the water trough that collapsed." Samuel was blaming me as usual. "You looked so small in that moment, so beaten down. I knew right then I was going to fall in love with you, even though I tried to fight it." "Why did you fight it?" "Because you were grieving, and you were my employer's sister-in-law, and it seemed impossible. But then I figured out that sometimes the impossible things are the ones most worth fighting for." Katherine leaned her head on his shoulder. "I am so glad you fought. I am so glad you stayed when I gave you every reason to leave." "Where else would I go?" Garrett asked softly. "You are my home, Katherine. You always have been." Inside, Henry called out that supper was ready. Margaret laughed at something Thomas said, and the sound was like music. Katherine stood and pulled Garrett to his feet. "Come on, Cowboy," she said with a playful smile. "Our family is waiting." They walked inside together, into the warm glow of lamplight and the chatter of their children. Katherine looked around the table once they were all seated, at these people she loved more than life itself, and felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought her here. She had been blamed for things beyond her control, had carried guilt that was never hers to bear, had survived grief that nearly destroyed her. But through it all, one man had seen her clearly, had defended her fiercely, and had loved her completely. Garrett Quinn had given her back herself, and together they had built a life filled with purpose, joy, and deep abiding love. Years later, when Katherine was old and gray and surrounded by grandchildren, she would tell them the story of how she met their grandfather. She would talk about hard times and healing, about a man who spoke truth when everyone else stayed silent, about learning to forgive both others and yourself. "Nothing wrong is on you," Garrett had said to her once, and those words had changed everything. They had freed her to love again, to hope again, to believe that happiness was not something she had to earn but something she deserved simply by being human. And in the end, that was the greatest gift of all. Not just love, though that was precious beyond measure, but the gift of knowing that she was enough, exactly as she was, that her worth was not dependent on being perfect or pleasing everyone or never making mistakes. She was simply Katherine, a woman who had loved and lost and found love again, a woman who had survived and eventually thrived, a woman who had learned that the heart has an infinite capacity for healing if you are brave enough to let it. Garrett and Katherine Quinn lived long, happy lives together, surrounded by children and grandchildren, beloved by their community, and devoted to each other until their final days. When Garrett passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 73, Katherine held his hand and whispered thank you for everything. She followed him 6 months later, and they were buried side by side on the hill overlooking the ranch they had built together. Their great-grandson would eventually inherit the Quinn Ranch, and he would tell his own children about the legendary love story of Garrett and Katherine, about how a grieving widow and a wandering cowboy found each other in the wild California country and built something that lasted for generations. Because that is what true love does. It endures, it heals, it transforms, and it becomes the foundation on which entire legacies are built. Katherine and Garrett's story was proof that even in the darkest times, hope remains. Even when you are blamed for things beyond your control, someone might see the truth and stand beside you. And even when your heart has been shattered, love can piece it back together into something even more beautiful than before. Nothing wrong was on her, Garrett had said. And in believing him, in accepting his love and building a life together, Katherine had finally learned that he was right. She had done nothing wrong. She had simply been human, doing her best in impossible circumstances, and that had always been enough. The ranch still stands today, passed down through the Quinn family for over a century, a testament to the enduring power of love, forgiveness, and the courage to begin again. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun sets gold over the California hills, you can almost feel the presence of those who built it all, the cowboy and his beloved, still watching over the land they loved and the family they created together. Their story became legend in Red Bluff, the kind of tale mothers told their daughters and fathers told their sons. Not a fairy tale, because life is never that simple, but a true story about real people who faced real hardship and found real joy on the other side. It was a story about blame and forgiveness, about grief and healing, about a brother-in-law who could not let go until he finally did, and about a cowboy who saw a woman's worth when she could not see it herself. And at the heart of it all were those simple words that changed everything. Nothing wrong is on you. Words that gave permission to heal, words that offered absolution, Words that open the door to a future full of love and possibility. Words spoken by a man who meant them with his whole heart, and received by a woman who desperately needed to hear them. That was the legacy of Garrett and Katherine Quinn. Not just the ranch or the family or the success they built, but the reminder that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is believe you deserve happiness, accept love when it is offered, and trust that your story is not over just because a chapter has ended. Their lives proved that second chances are real, that love can bloom even in the hardest soil, and that the human spirit has an remarkable capacity for resilience and joy. In the end, theirs was a story about hope, and hope, as they learned together, is the most powerful force in the world.